Right, I'm hoping you can see that.
Yep, we can.
Yeah, good. So someone shouted back. That's good, because otherwise I'm just talking into nothing. Okay, so just by way of introduction, I suppose, and what I'm going to try and cover. So I've been asked to give a sort of an introduction to agroforestry. I'm a farmer in Cambridgeshire. I didn't start life as a farmer. I'm actually a first generation farmer. I started life as a soil scientist many years ago, when it was deeply unfashionable. In my current varied and diverse roles, I'm a farmer. I'm a county council tenant. We own a bit of land. I run a farm consultancy business called Abacus Agriculture for the last 23 years, helping farmers and land managers farm in a sort of regenerative or organic way. I am part-time. I'm head of technical development for the Royal Agricultural Society and Innovation for Agriculture, and I'm a non-exec director of the Agriculture and Horticulture Development Board. So I keep myself reasonably busy. The Nuffield Farming Scholarships Trust thing is I'm a Nuffield scholar, and actually I looked at agroforestry globally back in sort of 2010-11, traveled to many far-flung places in the world to try and understand what they were doing and see if we could get something to work here in the UK. And the link here with Morrison's is via the Forest Canopy Foundation, and that really, the Forest Canopy Foundation is a group of forestry and advisory businesses which can provide sort of end-to-end solutions for establishing trees and managing trees for landowners, businesses, etc., and matching corporates too, who want to plant and support the planting of trees with landowners. And that's not only woodlands or forests, but also, as I say, our involvement my involvement is very much on the agroforestry side. So what I'm going to try and do is give attendees to this webinar an introduction to what agroforestry is, how it's a sort of different approach to increase productivity and resilience on land, what it is, what some of the environmental and productivity benefits are, what some of the different agroforestry options are, and some experiences from my own farm over the next sort of half an hour. I guess firstly, driving some of these things, we're all acutely aware that actually we have to adapt our farming and land management systems to the challenges of climate change. Only last year, I think it was predicted that a 40-degree event in the UK would be a 1 in 100 chance. Well, it happened this year. And I think in my own farming career over the last 15 years, we've had the hottest, wettest, driest, coldest sort of events, and those records have been broken. So extremes are happening, and we've got to adapt our farming systems to cope with those extremes. And there's no doubt that farming and soils are all very much and the environment are very much in the sort of forefront of both policies and the papers, etc., on an increasing basis. And we've got agriculturally, we've got some pretty big challenges ahead where everyone is starting to question whether high input monoculture is fit for purpose. Is it yesterday's approach? Certainly the availability of inputs like fertilizers or agrochemicals, either through legislation or efficacy or indeed conflict and some of the geopolitical challenges at the moment, are making those have limited availability and a lot more expensive, which is undermining a lot of production systems. But we're being asked to increase productivity, use resources better, and protect and enhance biodiversity all at the same time. So there's some real challenges to sort of square the circle. But in its fundamental form, whether we are a farmer, a forester, or even a photovoltaic solar panel engineer, we're actually all in the same job. Our job is to capture sunlight, solar radiation, mix it with perhaps some water and carbon dioxide, and turn it into carbon-based products, which are either consumed by humans, or they're sold, or they're used by animals. So our job is the same. We harvest sunlight. And it dawned on me a few years or decades ago that cereal producers, at the time of year when we've got near maximum solar radiation and our crops are turning golden in the fields, as they did very early this year, we're effectively turning the solar panels off for 2.5 months. So we're not capturing that solar radiation and using it to drive crop productivity or grass productivity, but also feeding the soil biology below through that input of solar radiation and building carbohydrates, etc., which feed the soil microbiome. So how can we think about doing that better? And it got me thinking a decade or more ago that perhaps trees are important for climate change adaptation. We recognise they're very much the lungs of the planet, and trees could have a role within an agricultural context, and agroforestry perhaps could be an alternative approach. So what is agroforestry? It's where its trees are combined with crops and or livestock on the same unit of land, and where there's a significant economical ecological interaction. Now they can be both positive or negative, competition or complementarity, and we're trying to design systems which give or maximize the sort of complementarity and minimize the competition. And typically these are either silvopastoral systems, trees or woody perennials with livestock, or they're silvo-arable systems, trees with crop combinations. And it's not a new concept. So the picture on this slide shows northern France in the late 19th century, where we had quite different landscapes. It was only really post-war, with the advent of the Common Agricultural Policy, that we removed hedges and trees to make land eligible for direct subsidies and also improve mechanization and scale. And a lot of those sort of landscapes have changed both across Europe, globally, and here in the UK. It's worth remembering or thinking perhaps for a moment that nature doesn't do monoculture, and it doesn't do monoculture for two reasons. One, monocultures are a relatively poor use of space, and secondly, they're really, really risky. Having all one plant type inevitably leads to disease or pest attack, and doesn't use the resources in terms of light, water, nutrients, and the soil below ground in the most efficient way. But it is more complicated to have a sort of more diverse production system. So it's really thinking about how we can design complexity, but managed complexity into systems which give us resilience to a lot of the issues, problems like pests and diseases, but also remain manageable and productive. And this got me thinking really about how we manage not only light, but nutrients and water, etc. And the sort of graphic at the top shows that in the case of a cereal crop, perhaps the water and light and nutrients are used once the crop is established in the late autumn, right through over the winter period until the late spring, early summer. And then the crop is senescing and not photosynthesizing. Whereas the tree components tend to be dormant over winter and then tend to come into leaf in the very late spring, and then photosynthesize right through the summer, and then drop their leaves in late autumn. So there's a real temporal overlap in terms of using that solar radiation and the water and the nutrients over a much longer period of time. Also, many crops that we grow as farmers tend to be very two-dimensional. So we think maybe perhaps a meter above ground, and if we're lucky, a meter or so below ground. But if we can introduce sort of a mixture of perennial crops like trees or shrubs into the land use system, we can actually start creating a three-dimensional cropping system. So we've got different plants which use different space below ground and above ground in terms of canopy. And if they're designed right, they don't compete with each other directly for those water and nutrients and photosynthesis at different times of the year. So there's a spatial and a temporal element to how we might think about doing that. And this does require management. If we look at this graphic, and this is for both some work in the UK and also in France. On the right hand side, we've got a poplar forest plantation, and the tree roots tend to be pretty near the surface because that's where all the nutrients and water tends to be. And you can see from the photograph in the bottom right of an 18-year-old poplar tree that the tree roots are very near the soil surface, whereas the same tree of the same age, just a few meters apart but grown in an agroforestry context, has a completely different root structure. And that's partly because actually there's some cultivation happening near the surface, which tends to segment the roots and drive them deeper in the soil profile. But also that when the trees wake up in late spring and start putting leaf on, the cropping zone for either grass or cereals or vegetables, they've already utilized the water and nutrients. So the tree roots have to look deeper and underneath those other components to find the nutrition and the water they need. So it's very much segmentation of the different components. And this has important consequences because agriculture is pretty leaky. National statistics in the UK show that circa 50% of the nitrogen fertilizer applied to most arable crops never hits the intended target. It's lost through leaching, runoff, or into drains. It ends up in watercourses, which is why there's a big program of nitrate removal from drinking water, and there's also a European nitrates directive. So it's a pretty leaky system. As the graph shows, not much nitrate used in forestry because not a lot of nitrogen use. The graphic shows maybe 30 or 40 kilograms of nitrogen loss per year in agriculture. It can be a lot more than that. But agroforestry has the potential to reduce that by circa 50%, because what it can do is those deeper roots can grab hold of that nitrogen that would normally be lost and turn it into a different form of carbon, capture it and turn it into a woodier perennial. So it can improve nitrogen use efficiency by 40-50% perhaps. It also has a role in terms of biodiversity. So as I said before, a monoculture is at risk of having pest and disease outbreaks just by the fact that it's a monocultural system. By introducing agroforestry and having woody perennials, trees as part of the land use, there's the potential to have refuges for beneficial insects and predators, which can help with biological control of plant pests. So we can have improved pest management by having those regular refuges. And there's some really good research behind that in terms of proving some of these things. Some of the more recent research has shown, both in a European context and also a UK context, that the sort of regular refuges providing shelter within agroforestry and the food sources from the sort of biodiversity that's introduced, and indeed the microclimates that flow from that, can increase farmland birds, beneficial plants, both fungi and sort of insects. So we tend to have a high level of diversity within agroforestry systems. Some work done by Tom Stanton, a PhD student from Reading University in the UK, looked at different taxa and found that in sort of silver arable systems, we tended to have more of the beneficials. So the sort of harvestmen spiders, omnivorous ground beetles, parasitic wasps, pollinators, etc., tended to be better in agroforestry systems, and so most of the pests tended to be fewer because of the increased number of predators. And perhaps the only outlier there was the potential to have slightly more slugs and snails, although from I suppose from a practical point of view, I've never seen that as much of a problem in our own system or within others that I've looked at, because I guess there's more predators. And a lot of this data is quite well published in a range of scientific journals. Some work correlates quite well with some of the work done by Jim McAdam at AFBI, so the graphic in the bottom left, showing that actually when comparing grassland, ash agroforestry and ash woodland, that there tends to be more spiders, birds, beetles. The graphic on the bottom right is a range of 6 farms looking at biodiversity and pollinators between a monoculture system and an agroforestry system. And WHF, or Whitehall Farm, is our own farm, and we certainly had more biodiversity and pollinators, and we recorded 200% more solitary bees and hoverflies, 240% more bumblebees, and a 10 times higher species richness. So it's delivering on that sort of biodiversity benefits and that we're trying to seek within our own farming system. So how do we compare, perhaps moving away from some of the biodiversity benefits, how do we compare perhaps a monoculture system with an agroforestry system? So what's in the background to what's in the foreground in this picture? But one way to do that is to look at what's called a land equivalent ratio of productivity. So if we had a 1-to-1 ratio, either system would be equivalent in terms of its productivity. So if we take 1 hectare of agroforestry where the trees and the crops or grassland are grown on the same parcels, and we compare it to where they're grown separately, we would need 0.8 hectares of agricultural grain production and 0.6 hectares of trees to get the same level of productivity. That gives us a land equivalent ratio of 1.4, which means 100 hectares of agroforestry can produce as much crop and tree products combined as 140 hectares of farmland where they're growing separately. And you think, well, that's potentially up to 40% more productive. How can that be? But it's possible, really, because we're keeping the solar panels turned on for longer by capturing more photosynthetic input. So more photosynthesis to drive that productivity over a longer period of time, not turning the solar panels off. And we're also increasing the size of the farm, but in a 3-dimensional way. We're having more canopy above the ground and more root mass below ground. And it's not me just saying that. So big pan-European project looked at 42 tree crop combinations, and they found that actually the land equivalent ratios ranged worse from about 1 at best to 1.4, and the majority of them were around 1.2, 1.3. That's still 20 to 30% more productive of all the components over their entire lifespan than just a monocultural system. So there's real potential for agroforestry to increase productivity. And there are other benefits as well. You know, if we're thinking about, as we were with our own farm, improved soil and water quality management and protection of resources, there's some real benefits about having trees in the environment. We forget that in the UK we're in a pretty windy part of the world, and that if we can reduce wind speed, we can improve a microclimate, so warmer in the winter, perhaps cooler in the summer, and with these increasingly really hot periods in the summer, we can reduce evaporation and water loss from crops, so reducing the need for irrigation, etc. And even in very wet periods, the trees can aid towards sort of subsurface drainage and drain flow. So it's about modifying microclimates at a local level. But one of the biggest challenges is there's a massive level of confusion between what's forestry and what's agriculture, and what the hell is this agroforestry thing. Foresters and farmers typically have different goals, objectives, and interests. They use a different language and different metrics for measuring performance and productivity. So there's a great deal of confusion between the two, and you could say that farmers have a pretty healthy arbor phobia, and foresters have a pretty healthy agri phobia, and actually agroforestry is trying to sort of work in the middle ground. I've often said that farmers take a farmer and a forester to a field, and the farmers will look down at the crop or the ground, and the foresters will look up at the canopy, and they'll never make eye contact. And perhaps the only people looking forward are the agroforesters. So just something to think about. So there are many options for agroforestry in silver arable systems. It can be any combination really of woody perennial and crop. So that could be grain production and timber. It could be for biomass. It could be fruits or nuts. So any combination thereof really, depending on the local sort of agroclimatic environment, the market, intended market, the use of the end products, soil types, etc. So there's many different options of how these things can be combined. Silvopastorally, it can be planting trees and grazing around those trees, providing shelter and shade or even forage. Or equally at the other end, it can be actually opening up woodland areas and allowing those to be grazed by ruminants, cattle or sheep, to provide shade and shelter, but also forage. Or it can be traditional systems like sort of parkland type systems, which are doing that in a more landscape type environment. Or it doesn't have to be ruminants. It could be pigs and or poultry grazing in and around trees to provide a different habitat. In fact, there's been quite a lot of success with things like the Woodland Egg, Sainsbury's Woodland Egg program. If you think about chickens, they're actually woodland fowl or jungle fowl, I should say, and it's only us as humans that have domesticated them, spend an awful lot of time worrying about being predated by raptors. And if you provide them with a range and shelter, they can actually massively improve their productivity. So the trees for ruminants can certainly provide shelter from the sun in the summer or from the cold in the winter. It doesn't even have to be a tree. If you look at the one on the right, the picture on the right is actually of a wind turbine. So shade is becoming increasingly important over these hotter temperatures. They can also provide mineral browse for a range of ruminants, cattle, sheep, etc., in terms of trace minerals, protein-rich leaves, some medicinal benefits, and diet supplementation. And if you look at the value in terms of domestic livestock, in terms of what they would eat given a choice, you can see that cattle and sheep, somewhere between 12 and 20% of their diet, they would prefer coming from sort of trees and shrubs to supplement their diet, rather than just having all grass all the time. Goats, interestingly, they prefer to eat half their diet, more than half their diet, as trees and shrubs don't like grass quite so much. And the reason behind that really is, if you look at some of the nutritional benefits in terms of fats and sugars and proteins, they're pretty high in some of these tree species, even compared to things like hay and clover silage. They've got pretty good nutritional content, and I guess if you watch cattle and sheep, they don't only browse grass, they will browse the hedgerows, because they're getting something that we're not providing in a pasture-based system. So as I mentioned before, there's also the opportunity to convert woodlands to woodland grazing. Perhaps there's an awful lot of perhaps suboptimally managed woodland around the country, which could do with thinning, taking out some of the poor quality trees and timber, perhaps allowing understory to grow, allowing animals to browse and obtain shelter and graze under those. So there's a multi-use potential with the right sort of framework. This is perhaps looking further afield, not only in the lowland context, but in upland systems, both in Scotland and Wales, or even down in the southwest. There is potential to have agroforestry systems in upland environments where actually the provision of shelter by low density trees can actually massively change the livestock productivity in terms of providing that shelter, so animals are putting more energy into growing rather than just trying to keep warm or dry within quite exposed environments. And within a lowland context, there's a strong role for agroforestry in terms of riparian management. So riparian stream planting, or even improved hedgerow management or tree hedges, and actually managing hedges not only for biodiversity but for productivity, to provide income to the farming business. So there's a way about thinking about how we can integrate those trees into a productive environment. And as we see more climate extremes, actually having trees as part of shelter belts, both not only for wind management but also for water management, to reduce catchment scale flooding and slowing water stream across slopes. Again, there's a real role for that. So agroforestry has many assets, or many facets, I should say. So how does all this fit into a policy context? Well, we now have a new agricultural bill. So there's a pretty sweeping changes within agriculture happening right at the moment. There are some challenges around land tenure, with 32% of land tenanted in the UK. A long-term project like agroforestry and tree planting may not be as easy, or maybe even be inaccessible to those that are renting land on short-term tenancies. That's not to say it's impossible. Well, as I'll speak about with my own farm in a minute, there is moves afoot within DEFRA to provide longer-term measures as part of the Sustainable Farming Incentive and ELMS, which should be piloted next year in 24, become available in piloted next year in 23 and become available in 24 to look at supporting agroforestry production and establishment. And I think for the first time in many decades, we were starting to see forest and agricultural policies coming closer together rather than being divergent in their approaches. Back in 2020, so 2 years ago now, or a year and a half ago, agroforestry was recognised as a valid land use within the basic payment scheme while that exists. So there's a real recognition that planting trees now is a valid land use. It's not going to make land ineligible for current subsidy regimes, which is a real tick because that's been a barrier in the past. We now have the England Woodland Creation Offer. There is potential to do some agroforestry in there, but one has to be fairly imaginative. It's predominantly set up for the creation of woodlands. And there's some real challenges or real opportunities in terms of climate change. The Committee on Climate Change recommends that we should increase tree canopy cover from 13 to 17% to meet our net zero emissions. Actually, we haven't planted anywhere near enough trees over the last few years. 72% of the UK's land is farmland. So if we're going to put trees onto at any scale, some of that's going to have to go on farmland. And some work I did with the Woodland Trust suggests that a further 5.8% converted into tree canopy would meet our net zero targets emission under the Paris Accord. So that's a relatively modest increase to get to meeting our net zero commitments. So there's an opportunity here to think about how we can generate some income with those trees as well through carbon sequestration, depending on how the type of tree and how quickly they grow, the density that they're planted at, and how quickly they grow. There's somewhere between 1.5 and 4 tons of carbon per hectare every year. Carbon trading at 30 US dollars a carbon equivalent. So there's potentially up to sort of 100 pounds or so per hectare income, even from carbon sequestration. So I'm just going to run through a few slides and tell you what we've done on our own farm before we break for some questions. I farm in East Anglia in Cambridgeshire. We're first generation farmers owning some land, but tenanting most of that land from Cambridgeshire County Council. And we took on the farm back in 2007. The farm was actually converted to organic production straight afterwards. And we moved onto the farm pretty much as new entrants with a bag of spanners and a lawnmower. So we were starting from nothing and trying to develop a new agricultural business. Our drive was really that we wanted to increase our enterprise and cropping diversity. We want to have a multifunctional land use. We wanted to increase biodiversity and habitats and open up new markets. And in a very flat, open landscape on some very good quality soils, we discovered very early on, as this picture shows, within our first couple of years, that some of the soils were in a very, very poor and fragile state and very prone to wind erosion and being blown away. And as a soil scientist, I found this completely unacceptable and wanted to do something about this. Really was searching around for a year or so to try and think about ways that we could change or reduce these impacts and improve what we were doing. And that's what brought me back to agroforestry, which I'd been made aware of or worked with in tropical climates elsewhere in the world. So the challenge is really that our own farming business is that we were tenants, and I needed permission from my landlord. We had a 15-year farm business tenancy, so I needed an economic return within 15 years. We needed to retain common agricultural policy eligibility. We had limited capital. The system had to be profitable. We had no livestock facilities on the farm. I wanted to improve soil conservation, and there was limited information on commercial systems. So we had sort of short-term challenges for a long-term project, which we needed to sort of reconcile. But in 2009, we created an agroforestry system over 52 hectares, 125 acres. We chose to use apples, partly because at the time in 2009 they were an eligible crop under the Common Agricultural Policy. So this is pre-changes to the Common Agricultural Policy to include agroforestry. And they would also give us an economic return within the lifetime of our tenancy. And as I said, already limited capital, but it needs to be profitable, and it was something we felt we could add value to. So we established a system based on 85 trees per hectare, with 24-meter working alleys based on an alley crop system, 3-meter strips either side of the tree rows, and 3 meters between each tree. So 27 centres and 24-meter working alleys. And so they went in as 1-year-old trees. We were wanting to adopt a system where we could still use, proper large-scale farm machinery. So what were open fields, as you can see there, we bisected with alleys of trees back in 2009. We undersowed all the trees with a sort of pollen nectar mixture for biodiversity, but also to attract pollinators, obviously having a fruit crop in the mix as well. And that all worked quite well. And then, the years go past, the system operates, and we end up with 52 hectares of very much a sort of mixed landscape of fruit trees and cereals being grown. We harvest the cereals and then we go back and harvest the fruits. We finished cereal harvest this year in August. We're just about to start fruit harvest next week, and then we will go on and sow some autumn cereals again. This has led us to a couple of sort of interesting things that we hadn't quite anticipated. We developed a controlled traffic farming system with a 24-metre alley in between the trees. All our machinery is now 6 metres. So we have 6-metre cultivators, 6-metre drills for sowing cereals. We inter-row hoe all our cereals with a 6-metre camera-guided, computer-guided hoe, and then our combine is 6 metres as well. So it's evolved into a controlled traffic farming system, which means that we're actually travelling in the same wheelings year in, year out, minimising compaction from agricultural machinery, etc. So that's one of the benefits. That's also allowed us to create very much a tiered system, so that not only do we have trees at a higher level with a canopy, we've got a cereal crop growing, and then if we undersow those cereals with a ground-based cover like a clover or a legume, we can actually have a 3-tiered system. So we've always got the solar panels turned on right throughout the year. There's always something dying off and always something growing new. So that's more sort of what the system looks like now. Undersown legumes and wildflowers under the trees, sort of controlled traffic farming system running between the lines of trees. With more mature crops, we have to learn to drive the combine straight. I'm the one that does the combining, so that all works quite well. And then we'll harvest the cereal crops and go back in, as I said, next week, and we'll start harvesting the fruit crops. And then those fruit crops will go into either juice or sold as fresh fruit. That's what it sort of looks like from the air. So it's a sort of alley cropping system. You can see the sort of 4 runs of the combine up between the rows of the trees. One of the unexpected benefits, I talked about microclimate earlier on, back in 2009, we had 3 or 4 days of 60-mile-an-hour winds right in the middle of harvest, when all the grain crops were ready, and they sort of self-thresh themselves in the fields, with losing about 20% of the grain in the open fields without the trees, just dropped onto the ground, which is obviously a massive economic loss. Where we had the agroforestry, we only had about 10% loss. So we halved our losses, because by reducing the wind at ground level, we were getting less disturbance in the field crops. We lost a few apples from the wind, but it was doing its job in terms of reducing some of the losses. And some of the other things that we hadn't quite expected is that we always thought that in the middle of the alleys we'd have bigger crops, and the trees would have some shade competition and reduce crop growth through water. But we're actually seeing the reverse through a mixture, I think, of improved drainage in the winter, perhaps some shading and some reduced evapotranspiration in the summer. We're starting to see improved, we are now seeing improved crop performance right adjacent to the tree lines, sort of 3 to 6 meters out. So much so that I actually have to tilt the header on the combine to account for the higher crops right at the edge next to the trees. And whilst you can see it there, the combine header gives a nice datum. It's lower, crops lower at one end and higher next to the trees. On my screensaver at home, I have a picture of a friend's farm down in Poitiers in France, where he has walnuts and wheat growing. And actually, you can see the same effect on the sort of crop edge, and there's an impact on the trees. And we think that's partly improved soil conditions and better mycorrhizal associations, etc. But this is about managing the trees and the tree roots to achieve that. So with our own business as well, just to give you a bit of explanation in terms of what we do with those apples and fruit. Back in 4 or 5 years ago, we converted some barns into a farm shop. So we now retail all our fruit, either directly as fruit or as juice, direct to the public. So some of the research shows that agroforestry delivers on biodiversity, delivers on sort of a different landscape, improves soil, water and air quality and its protection. A lot of the economic data shows equivalent economic output or improved because of this increased productivity. There's certainly some level of climate change adaptation and resilience being built in by having a mixture of perennials and annuals, but it is more complex, that's for sure. But as I said right at the beginning of this talk, with climate change starting to really bite, we're all going to have to adapt and innovate, and that's going to be key to our farming systems. And agroforestry might be one of those vehicles, which one of those systems which has the option for farmers to think about how they can integrate it either with cropping and or livestock. So in summary, really, agroforestry is very much ecological intensification. It's using what's already there, but better. It's improving resource capture and use, profitability equal to or greater than monoculture systems. It has benefits in terms of environmental protection and biodiversity. The nice thing is that it's not the entire farm. In our own system, we've only got about 8% of the land area with trees on it. 92% is doing exactly what it was doing before, growing crop or rearing animals. So it's having one component in a long-term economic return cycle, and the rest in a short-term return cycle. And the policy developments are really starting to ramp up now in terms of ELMS and SFI to actually support agroforestry over the next couple of years. So agroforestry is a climate smart sort of breakthrough approach to agriculture. We could easily adopt agroforestry on many farms on just 20% of the land area, and 5.8% of the land area would meet our net zero emissions for climate change. So we're nowhere near that. And it's one of those few options with the potential to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions, help protect natural resources, whilst at the same time producing more food and biomass that doesn't need more input to get more output. And trees will grow in most places, I think, other than the Arctic and the Antarctic. Trees will grow in most places given the chance. And adopting systems where not the entire farm, but maybe a proportion of the farm, maybe 10 or 20% of the farm, to meet our net zero targets could be very achievable. And I took this picture actually in Canada, and I thought it was quite nice that the solar panels were mimicking a natural system of leaves to capture solar radiation. And often we think, well, this can't work, but it can work. And often the most dangerous phrase in our language is, well, we've always done it this way, but perhaps we need to think about doing things in a different way. So I'm open. I'll stop this now, and I'll be open for some questions for those that are on the webinar. Thanks very much.